Hello there. Today I have another point to make about this armor. Today's point is that I believe that armor like this would occupy a very different socio-economic role than armor within a metalworking society. Now, if we imagine heavy metal armor, our conception of that armor is sort of tied into the idea of the warrior elite, so the knight, the samurai, etc. We imagine a medieval battlefield. You're going to have your knights in heavy armor, and then you're going to have your peasant levies who've got little to no heavy armor. They might have a helmet, they might have a gambesson or some leather thing that they threw together out of scraps. The notion of heavy armor goes along with a certain social role. The reason for this is the economics of metal armor. Metal armor is a highly specialized craft, which is dependent on a lot of other highly specialized crafts. Not only is the manufacture of metal armor something that takes the better part of a decade for a craftsman to master, so before that metal even reaches the armorsmith's workshop, it's already endured hundreds, possibly thousands of hours of skilled labor. First, the ore has to be mined, and the ore has to be smelted. Then the iron has to be refined to get out the impurities so that it can be worked thin into sheet metal. Then it has to be worked into sheet metal. Then those pieces of sheet metal have to be forge welded together to make a usable sheet. Then and only then does it arrive at the armorsmith. What this means is that the knight cannot produce his own suit of armor from scratch on his own. There's not enough days in a year, there's not enough years in a lifetime for him to learn all of those skills. Each one of those skills requires specialty training, specialty equipment, so on, so on, so on. What this means is that if the knight wants to acquire a suit of armor, he has to obtain it through the economy, which means that he has to have a high enough income to support the purchasing of this armor, to pay for all of those craftsmen and all of those steps on the road to him acquiring his suit of armor. And this is where we get the idea of the warrior elite, the knight as a social class. So the knight, he funds his armor by taking rents from his tenants. The knight is a major landowner. The knight is allowed to own this land because he performs a service for the king. The knight is the most valuable combatant on the battlefield, and the king rewards him for this. So the knight's status as warrior elite grants him the income he needs to fulfill his role as warrior elite. It's sort of cyclical and arbitrary. It doesn't necessarily need to have any logical starting point. Because this status is essentially arbitrary and self-reinforcing, the knight is the warrior elite because he is the warrior elite. It ties in with the feudal ideas about class. Now, wooden armor, I believe, is going to have a very different socioeconomic role because of how simple it is. So if we look at this armor here, it's made out of sticks and string and a couple bits of leather. None of the materials that go into this are very complicated or contingent. The armor itself is not very difficult to make. If you've got a knife and an axe and you can whittle a straight line, you can produce this armor. If you got fingers, you can make string. Neither of these take a lot of skill. The ingredients are fairly simple. You can produce them yourself. And even if you don't produce them yourself, they aren't specialized tasks either. So what this means is that the availability of armor is not tied to any kind of economic status. It's not tied to any kind of social role. More than anything else, all that this armor takes to acquire is time. Do you have enough free time to invest in producing string for this armor? So if we think about it in that way, the fellow with the best suit of armor, the most complete suit of armor, it might not have anything to do with his income or a reason, whatever stand-in we choose to use. The guy with the best suit of armor, he might just be the guy who broke his leg a couple of years ago falling out of a tree and had to find something to do while he recuperated. That's an interesting idea to me. Now, we think about the string that goes into this. This is rather a lot of string. Sitting down and spinning all of that, it's a rather daunting prospect. However, if we take this amount of string and we think about what else could I make out of this, let's imagine I was going to sit down and weave this string into cloth. What could I make out of that cloth? Well, maybe a tunic. If we think about this amount of string in terms of fabric, it's not a ton of string. I can also get away with quite coarse string here, coarser than you would want to use for a tunic. So it is a lot of string, but it's not a lot of string in the standards of clothing. This is a totally manageable amount of string to produce. Even if it wasn't, there are shortcuts you can take. You don't have to use string at all, you could use leather cords. Now that sort of thing wouldn't work quite as well, but it would work. Additionally, if we imagine any given society, a certain percentage of the population is going to be non-combatants. Now, if we imagine a social circle coming together to equip the most fit for battle of their social circle, this amount of string becomes totally feasible. This is not a ton of string for 3 or 4 people to produce. So maybe the fellow who has the best suit of armor, he's not the most economically situated, rather he might just be the fellow who's got the most female relatives. Or additionally, it could indicate social ties. He's the guy who's got the most people who like him, who are willing to donate string to keep him alive. He could be the guy whose wife loves him the most, willing to take time out of her busy schedule to make string. So on, so on, so on. Rather than carrying these economic connotations, they carry social connotations. I also think that the idea of the warrior elite either has a completely different meaning within the context of a society which uses wooden armor, or else it has no value whatsoever. That is, armor would not be the exclusive domain of the rich, the powerful, the accomplished warriors. I think that anybody who'd lived to 30 would probably have had enough time in his life to produce as much armor as he desired. I read a paper once talking about class structure, social inequality, that sort of thing, as a product of specialized labor. And these thoughts that I'm having sort of click with that. For me at least, it's a very interesting angle of inquiry. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up before I run out of batteries or something goes wrong. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this interesting.